At least one of my burnouts was I stepped down as the CEO of my company, went offline completely for 6 months and moved back in with my mum. My company was headquartered in San Francisco. I was living on a coastal villa in Mexico. And, then all of a sudden I'm back home living with my mum, just tending to her garden and doing some light meditation and therapy. People that grew up with ADHD as kids, whether they knew it or not, during the childhood of someone with ADHD, we experience thousands, tens of thousands more criticism than the average kid. I kind of see flow and burnout on two very separate ends of the spectrum of performance, basically. When you're burnt out, performance goes down, motivation goes down, you're physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausted. And when you're flowing, it's almost the opposite.
Welcome to The Secret Resume. I'm Melody Moore, leadership consultant, coach, and endlessly curious human. For over 20 years, I've been helping leaders unlock potential in themselves, their teams, and their organisations. Before we dive in, do you want to know how entrepreneurial your leadership really is? Why not try my entrepreneurial leadership diagnostic? It takes just 10 minutes and gives you instant insights to grow your impact. You'll find the link in the show notes. My guest today is Jamie Toyne. Jamie, welcome from, you're in Australia, I'm in the UK, so we're in very different time zones, but please let's start by telling the audience a bit about yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on your show. I'm excited to be here and have a yarn with you today. Well, what's going on for me right now? I'm in cuddly clothes. It's becoming winter over here. I've got my loose-fitting baggy pants on and some slippers. And what I've been doing today, I've been recording a bit of video content for my new YouTube channel.
Nice. And is your YouTube channel out, or is that something we can look out for?
It's probably more of a lookout thing at very early stages at the moment. But yeah, look out for it, I'd say.
Just curiosity, YouTube, why a YouTube channel?
It's the platform that I like to get information from. So I, try to connect with like-minded people. And so yeah, it just feels like I just pick the channels that I use. So I'm not on any social media platforms. So yeah, newsletters and YouTube is what I use to get my information from. So they're the two channels that I want to start producing on.
And you're not on any social media, you said?
I'm not. I haven't been for 8.5 years.
Why is that? I'm curious.
That is because I have ADHD and I value my time and my mental health. And I've found that it is horrific for productivity and mental health. So I've just steered clear for quite some time.
And do you find that, do you use it for business? Do you have people who use it for business for you?
Yeah, so I haven't used it for business most of my career. I've relied a lot. I've been in B2B services most of my life. And so I've relied on word of mouth a lot and sort of referrals. But yes, now that I am even starting to do YouTube and newsletters and starting to be active on LinkedIn, which is a social media platform, I guess. Yes, I have a small team of content creators and managers that do that. So I spend my time in Google Drive documents mostly.
Yeah, so you don't have to actually, I find that really interesting. The received wisdom is you have to be on social media and, almost people, I see 1,000 million posts about using AI and how terrible it is to use it in your content. In my view, it's no different to using a content manager or a copywriter. All the copywriters will be screaming now, whatever they're listening to because they obviously don't like people using AI because it's going to have an effect on their business. But to me, it's no more cheating than using a copywriter or a content manager, or it's a different way of doing it.
No, there's no cheating about it in any which way. I mean, you think about the Jimmy Fallon show or Beyonce getting on stage and dancing. They've got a team of 100 people behind the set, helping them do. It's a team effort, and so. Yeah, don't see it that way at all. They all use AI, so I'm double cheating. I've got a team of people and they're all using AI. So, but mind you, the content, I create the content. They just sort of edit it and interact with the platforms. So,
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. No, interesting. And I love to hear the fact that you're not on social media. I feel complete burnout with it at the moment, and I'm feeling the same, that I don't want to. So I find that interesting that you don't use it. Right. Let's jump back in time to start your story, shall we? We're going to start talking about you and talking about your mother. She was the first person who came to mind when you were thinking about what to talk about. So why don't you tell us about her, why she's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you asked me about places, experiences, people that have influenced me. And so immediately mum is top of the list. She's shaped my life more than anyone. She raised me. I was lucky enough to get paired up with her when I was 3 months old. So I was adopted by my mother and father, but they separated when I was 6, and mum was the one that really did the raising. And so, yeah, we have a beautiful relationship. I was a very troubled kid and very much struggled through primary school and high school, behaviorally more than academically, but it definitely affected my academics as well. And so, she had a tough job. She had her work cut out for her. I'm always speaking with teachers and principals, and I got expelled from a school, and we had to move interstate at one point. And she just always stuck by me. And the reason she's been such a big influence on my life is because I have ADHD, so I interact with the world in a bit of a different way, and a lot of the neurotypical systems, or rather the systems and the societal cultures and norms that we all live in, are sort of developed by neurotypical brains. And so I really struggled against a lot of systems, particularly sitting in a classroom with 15, 20 people or 25 people. So she wasn't one of those authoritative parents that tried to mold me into something that I clearly wasn't. And, I tried to, I was sort of like a square peg trying to fit through a round hole in, many aspects of life, and still am. As an adult, I have a lot more freedom to design my world to be a nice, square shape so I can slide through and there's no friction. But certainly she was just my greatest support moving through, early childhood and adolescence, and just allowed me to follow my dreams as well. So, I had ambitions of being a professional tennis player. She supported that financially, and also allowed me to drop out of school to pursue, join the pro circuit and play professionally. So, a lot of parents would not have allowed their kids to drop out of school. And it was just great for me because I was such a hyperactive kid that needed to be active at all times, and basically like a dog that needs to be walked or run ragged every morning so they're not annoying around the house. That was me. That was my energy, and still is. I have to take myself for a walk every morning.
Did she take you out like a dog then and make you run around?
Yeah, she was good.
Yeah.
Absolutely. She'd always bring balls, and yeah. And, I was enrolled in lots of different sporting programs and stuff. So yeah, she was very supportive and worked with the way I was wired and not against the way I was wired, which was a lot of the friction that I came up against in everyday life, socially and academically, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
And is she still around? Is she still supportive of you and doing all of those things for you now?
Yeah, she's still kicking, and absolutely. I think, she wouldn't necessarily reflect on her parenting as, I think she probably describes it as, holding on to a bucking bull at the rodeo and not really knowing what she was doing or whether she was doing the right thing. And she certainly got a lot of criticism and a lot of pressure from other parents, kids' parents, her peers, teachers, of course, for not being strict enough on me and for, giving me a lot of slack. But yeah, if I reflect on my career post school, like it kind of skyrocketed, and it did because I didn't have a lot of the same shame complexes that a lot of kids with ADHD had, which was that they're a bad kid and they're, dumb and they've got poor discipline and they can't listen. And, so I, still backed myself to go to university and, and apply for a big tech job, and had the confidence to start my own business when I was quite young. So yeah, and I attribute a lot of that to the way that I was raised, really, and the way that I was loved.
Did you have siblings?
I have many siblings, but it was just mum and I. So I've got a family tree as crazy as they come, but that's through my biological side and my father who adopted me remarried and had 2 children. So I've got a smattering of siblings with all different backgrounds that look all very different, but none look quite like me. I'm the only person with sort of Ghanaian African roots. My biological father's from Ghana and my biological mother's from Greece. Yeah. So I've got some Greek siblings and some Anglo-Australian siblings, and I imagine probably some Ghanaian siblings somewhere too.
And what was that like growing up, just you and your mum? I'm a single mum growing up with one daughter. So I'm
Yeah.
curious as to your experience. My daughter's only 15, so I'm curious with your experience,
Yeah.
just the two of you growing up.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think I remember being lonely at times, not like just,
Mhm.
like wanting another kid to play with in the house. But I grew up in a very small town with a very strong, close knit community where we could walk around to our neighbors' houses pretty frequently. And I had a lot of freedom in that regard. So that's how I sort of navigated that. And aside from that, I mean, it was just normal. I didn't know any different. I just remember being jealous of my friends who had siblings that they could play with after school. And
Mhm.
when when I wasn't able to go over to a friend's place and I did have to stay at home, I was by myself, whereas my friends had other people to play board games with or muck around with in the backyard. So yeah, it's pretty much my only reflection there.
Do you think that made you good at finding your own entertainment?
Hmm. I think I was good at that, entertaining myself. Yeah, probably. Had had something to do with it for sure. I've lived alone as an adult for long stretches when I've not had a romantic partner or been in a share house or whatever. And I've really enjoyed that time. And I've noticed that other people really struggle with that. But I'm an extrovert and very, very social. So I definitely need a lot of interaction. But yeah, I guess because I am so social, it's nice to recharge the batteries at home where there's, I'm not sort of compelled to talk to someone because they're there.
Yeah. It's
Mm.
interesting. I'm curious then about that. If living on your own, extroversion. A lot of extroverts I know hate living on their own. Do you
Mm.
make? Do you then find you're reaching out to people, like you're making the interaction?
Yeah, I'm very proactive with those things, and got things on every night, social things on every night. Straight after this, I'm going to have steak night at the pub with a few friends, and so yeah, it wasn't. I didn't find it lonely. I found it. I'd get home at 10:30 in the evening and just like flop into bed, and I wouldn't stay up chatting with my housemate or hanging out with my girlfriend or whatever when I got home. Or so yeah, no, I found living by myself quite nice. But actually, right now I'm living with my best friend, which is lovely.
Nice, nice. So you've got
Mm.
someone you can go and chat with.
Yeah.
I find I get more. I think I would also describe myself as an extrovert, but I think as I've got older, I get more introverted. I'm just like being on my own a lot. So let's move on and talk about you mentioned tennis. You left school. So when did you leave school?
I don't know what this grading system is in the UK, but basically we go up to K-12, kindergarten through year 12. At the end of year 10, I was sort of asked to politely move on from the school I was at in my small town in the middle of Australia. So I grew up in a very remote town called Alice Springs, which is maybe like a 2.5 day drive to the nearest city that's bigger, that got more than 30,000 people. So extremely remote, about 15-hour drive. Sorry. Yeah, about a 16-hour drive. And yeah, I moved to Melbourne. I got a scholarship to a sports school there as part of the tennis program, but because of my behaviour in the classroom, I wasn't able to participate in the school program. And so, yeah, I got permission from the State Department of Education to study remotely and train at Melbourne Park, which is where the Australian Open's played. And so I trained there full time, and then was responsible for sitting exams and studying in my own time and submitting assignments essentially in my own time. And so I got paired up with a tutor who I would work with 3 days a week for an hour or two. And that one-on-one learning for me was game changing, compared to having 25 people in the classroom. The last person I wanted to listen to was the teacher. I just wanted to interact with all the kids in the classroom. And so, yeah, I was, I found that quite good for me. And, I actually enjoyed learning. It wasn't that I didn't enjoy learning. It was just that the environment was just chaos for me. Well, I mean, I was creating the chaos, but I couldn't focus basically.
But you found working with the tutor, just because it's one-on-one, you could focus.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, all the attention and focus was on me, so it was obviously a lot easier to stay focused and listen and learn without so many distractions. So yeah, so I was about 16, and I finished school. But I did it as I was traveling around playing tennis tournaments in my hotel room between matches and training and things like that. And I split my final year, which we call year 12, over 2 years just to lighten the workload that I had to do. So I, could focus predominantly on my tennis. There was no rush to finish school because I was trying to go pro.
And so were you were traveling around, your mum was traveling around with you, or were you traveling with
No,
the coach on your own?
mostly by myself. Couldn't
Wow.
afford to pay for the coaches accommodation and flights. So no, I was just traveling by myself. Pretty independent traveler. I would travel. I'd have to take 2 flights across the country from the age of 8 or 7 or 8. So I've been a jet setter from a young age. My dad lived over the other side of the country and I would fly there to go and stay with him in the holidays. And then, as soon as, I used to travel for soccer and tennis and, obviously you'd be with a team or a group of tennis players when I was younger. But yeah, by about 16, I'd just shack up with another tennis player on the tour and we'd stay in a shitty little caravan park and make chicken sandwiches for lunch and spaghetti bolognese for dinner and play tennis.
That's amazing. And your mum, how did she feel about you going off and traveling around?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think she was, I don't know. I think probably the hardest thing is how much of a financial hit it was taking to her. Extremely, extremely expensive sport. And I wasn't making much prize money. I definitely wasn't, my prize money wasn't making a dent in the costs. I did eventually secure a very fortunate sponsorship that sort of was like an all paid sort of sponsorship where they covered all my living expenses for a while there, away from home and training and stuff like that. So that was great, but that created a lot of pressure for me to perform. It wasn't a traditional sponsorship. It was basically the deal was that it was more of an investment actually. So he paid for everything and he would get 10% of the profits of my prize money until I paid him back. So it was a philanthropic sponsorship in a way. Like he wasn't trying to really make money out of me, but
It's almost like a loan.
yeah, I guess it is like a loan. Yeah, it's a very good deal for me. I mean, he was absolutely taking a punt. The likelihood of making it as a pro tennis player is extremely thin. And yeah, I mean, I was lucky, but I think at the time it just felt really overwhelming. I felt a really big pressure to be much further ahead in my career than I was. And so I stopped really being able to enjoy competing. And I was very much in my head and fixated on the gap between where I was and where I needed to go. And yeah, I stopped enjoying tennis. And it wasn't too long before I sort of had a bit of a breakdown and a burnout and quit the sport forever.
I have read a book by Judy Murray, Andy Murray's mum, and she talks about how it's a sport for kids with money. She's really passionate about the fact that it's not accessible for many people because of the costs involved and how it's such a small number of people who are making any money from it. That sounds like that was your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I could see the likelihood of me, very quickly on the pro circuit. I was 17, bunking up with 2 guys in their mid-20s who'd been traveling around the world, playing the circuit for years. And they couldn't rub 2 pennies together. And in some cases, their parents were still, supporting them financially. And so, yeah, I think, the combination of not enjoying playing tennis anymore and also looking at, the long road ahead. Yeah, I guess I decided to go to business school instead.
And how you got into tennis in the first place?
Yeah, I was a very athletic kid. And so any sort of sport, particularly with the ball, I was pretty handy with. So I was a soccer player really as a kid. And then, yeah, very savvy tennis coach would go around to all the schools and set up a little mini tennis net and get people to, play. And he came to my primary school and I played, and he said, you should come along for a lesson. And, the first few lessons were free and I got pretty hooked. And he was just a fantastic coach in general. So he created a lot of opportunities. Again, we lived in a very small town in the middle of nowhere. So he would organize these fantastic trips to Tasmania and WA and all over the country. And we would go as a group of 15 of us, and we'd get absolutely flogged by the city players that were way better than we were. But we'd have the most amazing time. And, I got to, travel around the country from quite a young age. And so he created a lot of opportunity. And I think even though soccer was absolutely more, or football, I should be saying, absolutely more probably suited to my athleticism was, and my body type, I think, I doubled down on the tennis just because there was so much opportunity there.
And you said partly that pressure, it was partly the pressure of, someone else is funding you and you need to perform. Tell me about that and what impact that had on your play and your head.
Yeah, it's really interesting because sport for me, for most of my childhood and adolescence, was the one area where I could excel. So coaches weren't saying I was bad at listening. Coaches weren't saying I wasn't bad at following instructions. I was actually a good student on the sporting field because I was engaged and I loved it. And it was also the place that would pull me into these flow states where my mind would go calm and I wasn't, having 1,000 thoughts a second. And so I loved being active. I loved playing sport. I loved competing. And the easiest way I can describe it is that when I got that sponsorship, there was this external pressure and expectation, and I was no longer in my body on the tennis court. I was completely in my head. So, I would, look at the draw of who I'd drawn for the first round and the second round and the third round if I kept winning. And, I'd start looking ahead and being like, well, I need to get to here to get these amount of points to get into the next tournament or to make this amount of money. Or it just became very cerebral and not a somatic joy anymore. And I guess my mindset shifted, became a very fixed mindset. I was no longer just focused on improving and enjoying the process of getting better as a tennis player, and became very fixated on past results and future results. And so, I played poorly because I wasn't able to access those flow states. So my performance dropped, my motivation dropped, my attitude started to get really stinky. I started throwing more tantrums on the tennis court. I was just miserable. In fact, I was probably depressed really for that year that I was on the pro circuit. I was losing a lot of matches because I was green and not as good as everyone else. And I guess I had this new measure. Getting the sponsorship I didn't take it as like a vote of confidence. I took it as I had imposter syndrome. I didn't think I deserved the sponsorship. I think there's some valid claims to that as well, to be honest. And I felt a lot of pressure to, live up to that potential, I suppose.
And I know a lot of your business now is about flow. So what did that teach you about getting into flow and the things that take you out of it?
Such a good question. Yeah. So what did it teach me? I think, 12 years later on from that experience, I think it was when I started to, after a couple of burnouts in other areas in business, I think I started to look at the connection between sort of ADHD and burnout and flow. And I kind of see flow and burnout on two very separate ends of the spectrum of performance, basically. When you're burnt out, performance goes down, motivation goes down, you're physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausted. And when you're flowing, it's almost the opposite. You've got all these neurochemicals that are released in your brain, the neuroanatomy of the brain changes. You feel amazing, you feel energized, you feel focused, and, you experience time dilation where hours can go by and feel like minutes. So, I think flow is like this ultimate sort of presence, I suppose. And I guess just, after quitting tennis and then, going to business school and then working for a business and then starting my own businesses, I suppose, I experienced burnout over and over again, and it felt very similar to my burnout with tennis. I just wasn't enjoying the journey of what I was doing. And often, I'd get to the summit of some mountain. I had a goal of having $1 million worth of saving and traveling around the world before I'm 28 or something like that. And, I did that. And I think I burnt out 6 months later. So, like I kept setting these sort of equivalent to tennis trophies in my business career. And yeah, I think it was almost like, being a sort of someone that identifies as being sort of ambitious and like an overachiever, like always needing to prove something. The actual sort of day-to-day work that you're doing is really all that drive is towards some future outcome. So almost like the mentality is to grit your teeth, to push through, to grind, and then you'll eventually get to the top of your mountain. And at the top of your mountain, once you've slayed the dragon, there is this pot of gold, or your reward or your trophy, and then you can relax and be happy and successful. But every time I'd get close to the top of the hill and mountain and burn out, or I would reach the top of the mountain, I just kind of felt a sense of emptiness. And so I became really curious about, I just remembered back to, I used to also be a tennis coach as well after I quit tennis. And so, every time I'd be running these businesses with 20 employees and sitting behind a computer all day, and I'd go, why don't I just coach tennis? Because I'm not happy doing what I'm doing. And so, I went to go back to tennis and moments of, joy and flow. And I became interested about how I could cultivate that sitting behind a computer and working with clients. And I think a lot of it had to do with the relationship I had with myself. So, there's this overambitious sort of, what they call like, the rider, or what I call like the general, sort of the higher self that's sort of sets the vision and has all the ambition. And then you've got the workhorse that actually has to, do the work. And so there's such a disconnect between those two parts of myself on the tennis court and also in business, where, I was never satisfied. I could never switch off at the end of the day because I was never satisfied with what I accomplished, because the general had set the workhorse up for failure before the day had even started. My to-do list would consistently have 25 hours worth of work to be achieved in a 6 to 8 hour workday. And so, that just, when you're on that sort of hamster wheel, yes, you can sort of progress towards some outcome, but often that outcome, the juice is never worth the squeeze, is what I learned. And so the definition of flow is, as Mihai Csikszentmihalyi says, is he calls it an autotelic experience. And autotelic experience means that the action becomes the reward in and of itself. And so, that's what flow is. It's to be enjoying something. It's pure, it's enjoying the action as you're doing it. There is no other reason to be doing it. And it's not to say that we don't need purpose and, future goals to sort of point, a North Star to point our, invest our energy into. But it does mean that we should be enjoying what we're doing in the moment. And if we're not doing it right. And so that's sort of when that message came through, that's when I started to shift from sort of mergers and acquisitions work. I was doing sort of, consulting with entrepreneurs to wanting to become a coach, and to wanting to, one, live this way for myself and run my business that way, but also help other entrepreneurs, particularly ones with ADHD, to set up their business in a way that, where work feels like play. And it's the process of building the business is enjoyable, focusing more on the journey rather than the destination, without sounding too cliche.
I don't think it sounds cliche at all. And I think it's really interesting you describing, that you described them, your goals, as like tennis trophies that you were aiming for. But I'm really curious about this, meeting a goal and yet still feeling fulfilled by it. I guess I'm just generally really curious about goal setting and how we have it as a received wisdom that we should set goals, and that all organizations work in that way. I've worked with organizations around the world. Everybody sets goals for the organization, for individuals. And, I think a lot of people find them as demotivating as others find them motivating. But what you're describing there is finding goals motivating. But then when you get there, you're kind of like, well, meh,
Do you want to hear a funny statistic?
Yes, I do.
So So I mentioned I was in mergers and acquisitions. So myself and my company, the company that I used to run, Dealflow, helped more than 400 entrepreneurs exit their business. So we were sort of like the brokers that would do the deal making. And help them sell their business to an investor or a bigger company. And those 400 or so entrepreneurs, 80 to 85% of them, experienced burnout at least once, and most of them at least twice, during their founder journey. And 70% of them felt like empty, unfulfilled, lost after they exited their business.
Mm.
And so it doesn't just come from personal experience. It also comes from literally helping clients sell their companies, getting getting to the top of the mountain, receiving an amount of money that they can basically retire on, reach their financial freedom, and not, the juice not really being worth the squeeze. I mean, I don't think many of them would necessarily say that they wish they didn't sell their business, or they wish they, but I think they wish they'd approached their business differently. And most of them are so burnt out that they don't often go back in on, a lot of clients I work with didn't go back in and just, run a business the same way. A lot of them I've seen sort of figuring out what to do and what are their values? What is their actual sense of purpose?
Mm.
And so, yeah, I also question that, Melody. I think goals serve a purpose. I think having like a North Star or something that you're sort of moving towards. But I think what's interesting with my life is, at least for the last few years, is, and I say this to people quite often, if I sold my company, or if I achieved my dream of whatever my goals are for this current venture that I'm on, business venture, materially, my life would not change much at all. So like, I think the whole sort of like sacrifice and compromise for future reward, and that whole carrot and stick performance framework, I fundamentally disagree with it now. It does not work for my brain. And that's why I created the Flojo formula, which is, it's very much about, prioritizing autotelic experiences essentially. I don't believe in, a lot of the business rhetoric, and particularly in sport, it's different in sport, I think, to business. But, this mentality of just sort of suffering. You have to go through the painful. You need to go through the lonely chapter. That whole hero's journey that I mentioned before, I think I really challenge that as well.
Mm. I met a tax lawyer the other day who works with high net worth individuals. And he told me a bunch of interesting things, actually. A, how many high net worth individuals are leaving the UK because of our current tax regime. But the other is that he's worked a lot with lottery winners. So your average person, suddenly coming into a huge amount of money. And his view is it rarely works well. It doesn't work out for people. The majority of people that he met, they spent it all really quickly, or it didn't make them happy, or whatever. And that was really interesting to me, because so many people talk about, if I won the lottery, blah. But I just have this really strong sense, I've been in the business world for a long time, probably 30 years, and I've worked with lots of very senior people. And I don't know that becoming senior or being a founder and running your own business and whatever, I don't know that that's necessarily what makes people happy. And I really like this idea that you're talking about of you've got to enjoy the journey, because, there's almost that sense of careful what you wish for, isn't there? Because I don't think when you arrive somewhere, it's ever what you think it's going to be. We glorify these goals that we set, whatever it is. It might be getting married, it might be having children, whatever it is. But it's if you don't enjoy that process, then, you can be sorely disappointed when you get to whatever the end is.
It's so funny you say that, because I was just, you mentioned wedding then, and I was like, I've just happened to, I spoke at a wedding 2 weeks ago, and I'm speaking at one the following week, and of which to say that I'm very close to the people that are getting married, and so very privy to how their mental health is going leading up to the wedding and the organization of it. And yeah, like it's very interesting that some people really enjoy the process of planning for a wedding and other people hate it. And it's just an interesting, if you're suffering for 6 to 12 months and pulling your hair out and stressed, and then it's all over in 6 to 8 hours and you've spent $50,000 or whatever it is, it's those sorts of things that I think we don't question a lot. And yeah, there's a lot of, the ways that we behave is sort of, we're shaped by our external conditioning a lot of the time, unless we really challenge that and actively unlearn things. And so, yeah, work culture, I think, and entrepreneurship culture is very similar to like the tortured artist fallacy, which is, the tortured artist that has to be depressed and mangled emotionally to be able to create beautiful works of art. I think there's enough studies to show that that's more or less not true. And I think, that sort of same sort of fallacy carries over to, other industries, in the corporate world and also in entrepreneurship as well. I think it's hard it's a much scarier challenge to figure out how to be happy now rather than sort of delay the idea of, dangle the carrot of happiness down the road, actually.
Yeah. Have you read Big Magic by Liz Gilbert? Because she says exactly that about artists, creativity. Yeah, great book. I have a quote from
Big Magic?
From it. Big Magic, it's called. I have a quote for it on my wall.
Cool. Oh, beautiful.
She
Write that one down.
She basically says that the tortured artist thing is a myth and you don't have to. She talks about creativity. That's what the book is about. And you don't have to be a tortured artist in order to be really creative. And I found it very inspiring. Not that I had ever aspirations to be a tortured artist, but this idea that, that actually creativity comes, you can be relaxed and go, it's a flow thing again. But she also has this great idea. I'd be really interested to hear what you think. She has this idea that ideas come and visit you. And if you don't do anything with them, they go off and visit someone else. And that's why you see your exact idea that you had, somebody else taken that idea and run with it. And I just love this idea of like an idea kind of coming and floating around you. And if you don't pay it enough attention, it goes somewhere else.
The collective consciousness. That's interesting stuff.
Exactly. Interesting. Right. I honestly could talk about this stuff for hours, but I will move us on because I want to talk about, you've mentioned ADHD a couple of times. Talk to me about your ADHD journey. You were diagnosed as a child. Just, it's a topic that's of real interest to lots of people at the moment. So can you just talk a bit about your personal experience and then how you're helping other people?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was sort of one of those textbook cases, as I've already alluded to, like, with behavioral, just bouncing off the walls essentially. And so, yeah, I think my behavior at school, people would, teachers were sort of nudging mum to go and get me to see a pediatrician and see what's going on there. I didn't take any medication as a kid, and we kept that quite quiet. We didn't tell anyone about the diagnosis. The doctor was, thought that I was a pretty normal, okay kid. Didn't need the medication necessarily. It's a pretty crazy medication to be putting young kids on, to be honest, in my opinion. And it's just the way that I see that type of medication is a way for us to sort of conform to, systems and structures that aren't designed for our minds to thrive anyway. But yeah, so I mean, I didn't have ADHD labels at school or anything like that. I was just a naughty kid who was very disruptive. I sort of mentioned how that impacted my tennis, mostly in a positive way until I started getting into my head. Yeah, and I guess academically, I through more one-on-one, tutoring, he was, the tutor was able to adapt his teaching style to my learning style, and so I was able to learn quite effectively then. And university is quite flexible, so I thrived at university. I think I was sort of like. Basically topped my class in business school, which was crazy for me because I was always struggling in high school with grades. And yeah, I think, I worked in a tech company for a few years, and, as far as working for someone else, those, working for a tech startup, very flexible environments, and you can sort of work from home and work whatever hours. And so that really worked for me as well. And then, I've worked for myself for the last 12 or 13 years since I was about 23. So yeah,
Can you,
when I reflect, yeah, go ahead.
can I just ask you a sort of, if you don't mind, like, I think a lot of people talk about ADHD, but don't necessarily understand it in terms of like when you're a kid in the classroom, what's happening in your head? Like, can you describe that? Like, how does it feel? What are what's triggering for you? I'm just really curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a spectrum, I think, and there's two main types of ADHD. One's inattentive and one's hyperactive. I've been diagnosed as an adult with having both, but I think what showed as a young kid was just hyperactive. What do I remember about the classroom? I mean, I just wanted to have fun. There was so many people to talk to in that classroom. There was so much noise. There was people clicking their pens. There was, you're quite hypersensitive to sensory stuff. So audio, visual, there's lots of people in the classroom. Everyone's crowded in a space. There's a teacher up the front who's drawing and talking in a really boring way about something and writing things on the whiteboard. So it's almost like being overstimulated and understimulated at the same time. And so, I would have to create my own stimulation, by interacting with people and making jokes and, being disruptive essentially. Yeah, and I just hated sitting still. I felt probably a bit anxious as well at times, and I wanted to move my body, and sitting in a chair and just sitting straight and looking straight towards the classroom was just torture for me versus running around on a tennis court, chasing a tennis ball and laughing with my friends and sweating and grunting and being exhausted physically. It's just a very different environment. So it's sort of like, Dr. Ned Hallywell, he sort of describes ADHD as, having a Ferrari engine with bicycle brakes. So, it's like your brain's going at a million miles an hour and you don't really have the best operating system to manage it. So, really impulsive, like I went to this training program after school called Stop, Think, Do. You can picture the three traffic lights. Do was the green and stop was red and think was yellow. And kind of insulting to think back on it and think that was the name of the program. But I mean, I guess that's what they were trying. I mean, it didn't work. It was a useless program, but it was for the naughty kids that were disrupting the classroom, I suppose. So yeah, and I think as an adult, what do I notice? Like, I mean, my office is is very sacred. No one can enter. Like, it's my focus room, and I'm not going to work in cafes. I'm not, if someone's talking in the kitchen or something like that, I'll probably, I'll struggle, I'll have noise cancelling headphones on. When I go to the airport, I'll wear sunglasses and headphones because the bright lights give me headaches and overwhelm me. And it sounds more like, traits similar to sort of other neurodivergencies like autism and Asperger's. But yeah, and then, I just do things to like have a bit more control over my sensory, my sensory overload when I'm in public spaces. And yeah, I think what's really, really interesting, I think, for most people that are curious about ADHD and noticing that there's a lot of diagnoses going on at the moment, wondering whether they have ADHD, I think the most interesting part of ADHD is actually a completely different symptom, completely different condition. And it's called VAST, which Dr. Ned Hallywell discovered and coined. And it stands for Variable Attention Stimulus Trait. And what's interesting about VAST is that it's not a neurological disorder of the brain like ADHD. It's not a permanent anatomical difference in the brain like ADHD is. It is caused by chronic cognitive overload. So because the average human is now interacting with digital devices for eight hours a day, just the fast-paced nature of the way that we live our lives, but also how much information our brains are having to process at once. We're texting and driving, or well, hopefully not, but we're on a webinar call and we're also responding to an email, or so there's habitual stuff, but there's also just, if you scroll on Instagram, which I don't do, but you could spend in a minute, you could be overloaded with more information than you would reading 3 newspapers. And so that chronic cognitive overload essentially overloads the brain, and it takes the brain out of homeostasis, where you experience the same symptoms as someone with ADHD. So lack of executive function, lack of impulse control, dysregulated dopamine, levels in your brain, really addicted to short dopamine cycles, and so, one of the big things that I've struggled with is addiction. I mean, I've been fortunate enough not to have particularly serious addictions that struggle with my health, like not serious drug addictions, but nicotine addiction, chocolate eating, a few different things like that. But, people with VAST, basically, it mimics ADHD. And so, you might have heard the expression that we all live in an ADHD world now, and it's kind of true. And so I find that the most fascinating part, because a lot of people that are getting diagnosed as an adult, I'd say, more adults than not probably would pass an ADHD test now, particularly if they work in certain fields. Like if they're sitting if they've got a computer job, I'd say most adults struggle to sit behind a computer and focus for 8 hours a day, because who can focus behind a computer for 8 hours a day? And so, yeah, and there's things that, I mean, I can talk about this later, but, in terms of the work that I'm doing and the problem that I'm trying to solve for myself and my clients is, how to reduce your cognitive load. What can you do to consistently reduce your cognitive load? And how can you manipulate, your neuroanatomy and your brain waves and your neurochemistry to, to be able to focus for longer periods of time and to stay on task and to not get overwhelmed. Another key probably difference between someone with ADHD and someone struggling with VAST is that someone with ADHD, it impacts every aspect of our life. So at a party or a social event, we're likely to get overstimulated, or, it can impact the way that we socialize. It's not just this thing that is impeding our ability to focus and be productive at work. So I guess that's what, there's, it impacts other areas of our life.
So it sounds to me, I really want to read about VAST. I think that's really interesting, because what you're describing is everybody I meet.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the VAST is like a subset of ADHD. I'm not saying that they're the same thing, but it's a subset of the symptoms maybe. And then ADHD actually is more broader. It's applicable in lots of different areas. So what was his name? Dr. Ned Halliwell, did you say?
Yeah, HALLOWELL. Yeah, a subsect, or rather, there's an overlap in the symptoms.
Yes.
And whether you've got ADHD or VAST, the solutions are more or less the same, in terms of what you can do to reduce the symptoms and improve your well-being or your focus or whatever. Yeah, one is permanent and one is temporary, I would say, is the only difference. And one is caused by environmental factors, and another one is caused by a combination of nature and nurture, I would say.
And you said you didn't medicate as a child. Do you medicate now? Sorry, and feel free not to answer that if you don't want to.
Yeah, no, I'm very open about. So I have almost gone my entire life without any sort of medical intervention. I was re-diagnosed as an adult because I was curious to try some of the medications. I also sort of suffer from anxiety and depression. So I medicated for that. And because I struggle with anxiety, which is very common, a lot of people with ADHD struggle with anxiety as well. Most of the medication for ADHD is amphetamine based, which is a stimulant, which increases anxiety levels for most people. So if I'm anxious, I can't focus. So if I'm taking this pill to sit in front of a computer and focus, but it's making me anxious, then the benefit cancels out. And they dull your personality a little bit. They make you a little bit more serious. So I'm, for the most part, I use, natural remedies to hone focus a little bit. And then your basic things like, sleep and nutrition and exercise and, and things like that. But I do have a script, and sometimes I'll take a quarter of the recommended lowest dose very early in the morning, so it's not going to affect my sleep and in the evening. And yeah, it's usually in extreme circumstances where I feel particularly sort of frazzled or scatterbrained, and there's some reason why I can't delay whatever important thing I have to do that day to another day. But most of what I do and what I teach is to design my entire life for flow. And so flow, you don't need pills if you can get into flow. People take drugs to get into flow. People take pills to get into flow. But if you know how to, you know, design your life so that flow comes naturally, then you've got a very good relationship with yourself. I mentioned the relationship with myself before. If you really know how to work with yourself rather than setting yourself up for failure, then I've found I haven't needed medication to consistently focus and perform and really enjoy what I do and get stuff done.
And it sounds, and correct me if I'm wrong, that part of that is about you have now created a world and an environment that you're able to have more control over. So, you said if you couldn't delay something, but it sounds like if you know that you're not in the best place, you would delay something. You're quite. It sounds like you're well attuned to yourself and what you're gonna be able to do or not do on a particular day.
Absolutely. Yep. Absolutely. So a good example of that will be if I get kept up all night for some reason, I'll treat that like an emergency and I'll cancel my meetings in the morning. Now, a typical business person would have conditioned in their mind that you don't cancel work just because you're a little bit tired. You push through and you da-da-da. But there's science to show how radically your productivity drops when you are underslept. That I'm not going to waste my time or anyone else's time if I've had less than 6 or 5 hours sleep. I'll just reschedule. There might be extreme circumstances where I won't, but yeah, I have a lot of flexibility and dynamicy in my schedule, and I work with creatives and entrepreneurs, so they can too if they like to admit it to themselves that they actually have a lot of control and agency over their life. Yeah, I mean that's a very crude example of the lack of sleep, but yeah, I do. I've got I work with all clients, but I've got female clients and an amazing friend of mine who has been doing some research and some coaching around the connection between the menstrual cycle and flow and how to design people's months in the different phases of the menstrual cycle to this is when you're likely to do your video production and this is when you're likely to do strategic thinking and this is when you're just going to chill out and not do much. And yeah, I think it's really important because I think we plan a lot around our external environment and we sort of basically we just react to our external environment. If someone says jump, we say how high. Someone says run, we say how fast. And yeah, I mean what happens is we have this external locus of control where everything in our we're sort of we don't have a lot of agency, and so when it's very we're trying to match our rhythm to someone else or a group of people or some other system. And yeah, I guess I'm particularly for neurodivergent people, but I think anyone who's we're all wired differently and we all have our quirks, is really leaning into how you understanding how you're wired and trying to design your life accordingly. I have some weird quirks. I'm not on social media because that's just like that's a way of radically reducing my cognitive load. The way I eat is not typical 3 meals a day at certain times because it works with the way that I want to be productive. And I know that if I have a heavy meal at lunchtime, I'm dead for 2 hours afterwards, and I'm not going to be able to work very productively. I'm very tired and it's very privileged. I also want to acknowledge that like I have a lot of agency and on my life, and the people I work with have a lot of privilege in that way too. So it's obviously not how everyone doesn't have that level of flexibility, particularly when working for an employer.
I'm also curious, as a parent, I think that's an area of your life where, you don't have much agency often, in that your children don't give you agency, particularly when they're young and they're all over you and overstimulate you. Do you work with people who are parents, and how do they?
I do.
That's an environment that's hard to control, I would say.
I do, absolutely. But I think the beautiful thing about flow is, so it's interesting that we've talked about the word control because a lot of what flow is about is actually letting go of control. But yes, I have just talked a lot about controlling environments and optimizing things. But absolutely, I'd say 30% of my client base are parents of different ages, but usually, young kids, or, some might be in early high school. I have one client who has ADHD, and her 3 kids have ADHD, amongst other neurodivergencies. And so they're an absolute handful. And yeah, it is really challenging. I think, again, it's really, if that relationship between sort of the general and the workhorse, so to speak, to come back to the 2 different parts of ourselves, that, the one that's sort of demanding excellence and setting these out, lofty goals, and the workhorse that has to do the work. I think if that the general who's got his head in the sky can have a lot of actual understanding of what it is, what reality is like on the ground, and have some compassion and understanding, you start to schedule your days and your weeks and your months in a way that is actually realistic. In the same way that, understanding your menstrual cycle is sort of like understanding that in this block of time, like, don't set yourself up for failure by trying to say you're going to write an essay during those 2 days that you're on your bleed or whatever it is. And so, yeah, the same with parenting. I can't speak from personal experience. I don't have children, but, reflecting on my clients' journeys, I think one of the biggest things that, that they struggle with, and that they're slowly getting better with, is just accepting what is, and sort of going with the flow of that, understanding that their capacity is significantly reduced during the summer holidays. I'm conscious that the summer holidays are coming up for a bunch of my clients in the US and in Europe. And, as an entrepreneur, it's like, every quarter we need to be growing. And, if part of your business is, part of your business's growth is still contingent on you showing up and delivering content or whatever it is, this part of the year is not going to be your most productive part of the year. And you need to design your projects and your life accordingly around that, because her life, her kids are everything as well. It's not, and I think starting to learn that our business and our personal life, like, there needs to be harmonization between those 2. So, like, when things are flowing and good in your personal life, things in your business are likely to start to flow as well. There is this sort of undescribable sort of synchronicity between the 2. When there's things that are out of whack, like, for me personally, I got totally knocked off my horse last year for some, in my personal life. And it absolutely impacted my business significantly in terms of my productivity, in terms of my motivation, in terms of my attitude. And that, the flow and effect of that is how it affected my sales and my revenue as well. So, yeah, I think when I talk about flow, I'm not just talking about those, short period bursts of 2 or 3 hours when we're in that altered state of consciousness that all these, Western neuroscientists rave on about. I'm talking about flow more holistically, really drawing from, like, Taoist text and, Zen Buddhism, and, like, it's all about it all flowing together. So, yeah, without really being qualified to talk about parenting at all, I think when things, I think what you were challenging was, or asking was, is it about how do you can't control everything, right? You can't control, there are things outside of your control. And I would say that what we often don't do is, we don't question what is not in our control. It's all just sort of bunched up together. And so I think there is a bunch of things that we can control that we, for whatever reason, we've been conditioned not to question, that we can adjust and manipulate to prime our environment and our lives for more flow and enjoyment and fulfillment. And then there are things outside of our control that we just need to accept and move with in a more, there's no point resisting, essentially, and sort of just going with the flow of that and moving around it. So that's a lot of businesses, like, push, push, push.
Yes. And I think what's really interesting, you talked about what you call the general and the workhorse. One of the things is that the general has to be on board, doesn't it? Because the general wants to be everything to be a certain way. And actually, what I find with people is they make a lot of assumptions about what an organization wants from them. But a lot of those assumptions are just things they think, not always. But you kind of have to, what I would call, from my sort of psychology background, your achievement motive, you've got to manage that in order to be able to go with the flow. It's nothing actually to do with other people. It's to do with your own sense of you have to grow every quarter, or, the rhetoric is that, a business that isn't growing is dying. I think that's bullshit, and I really like what you're saying, because it's very aligned with how I choose to live my life, but also I'm trying to help others as well. So I think that's really interesting. We are running out of time, which is sad because there's so much to talk about. But can you just briefly touch on burnout, your Silicon Valley experience, that kind of, and I'm interested, I suppose, in where ADHD might contribute to burnout. So just talk to me a little bit about your experiences. You burnt out, you said, in tennis, you burnt out in business. What's your experience with that?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I call, the tennis court, and then there's behind the computer. I've had a bunch of different businesses. Some ended in successful exits and some sort of crashed and burned and I wound down. But yeah, what can I say about burnout? I mean, it's such a spectrum. You can feel burnt out one day or for a week or something like that, and it can sort of go away. And then there can be this sort of, I don't know, like compounding burnout that just builds and builds and builds into what I would describe as a, you know, probably would qualify almost as a mental breakdown, potentially. At least one of my burnouts was. I stepped down as the CEO of my company, went offline completely for 6 months and moved back in with my mum. My company was headquartered in San Francisco. I was living on a coastal villa in Mexico. And, then all of a sudden I'm back home living with my mum, just tending to her garden and doing some light meditation and therapy. And so, yeah, I think we've touched on a little bit of it already, but I think that relationship that I had with myself was ultimately what led me to burn out in all three instances, on the tennis court and in two business ventures. Often I think if I think back to the time I was living in Mexico and I had this very financially successful company headquartered in San Francisco and clients all around the world, I was sort of sitting on the top of my mountain. I was learning Spanish. I was surfing in the morning and the evening and, probably working only 6 hours a day and making enough money to not have to work for a really long time, if at all, And so, yeah, but there was no, I don't know, there was no sense of that. There was no sense of that at the time. There was no sense of achievement, or I was having a good time at times, but I was also really stressed about growing the business and problems with my business partner. And so, I think a lot of that sort of attitude and relationship with self, I wasn't satisfied. I think another big part was, is alignment. Wasn't really filling my cup. And so the things that I focused on and the goals that I created was sort of what I would call vanity goals, right?
Mm-hmm.
They weren't really aligned with a deeper sense of purpose, or, I think parts of the way that I ran that business and the way that we service clients went against the grain of some of my deeper sort of core values that I was raised with as a kid. And so I didn't necessarily have that awareness at the time, but I think burnout can be caused from all manner of things, but generally speaking, it's not necessarily from a, too much effort. It's usually about putting too much effort in the wrong place. And so, I probably work more now than I have in the last 5 or 6 years, but I'm so happy right now and I love my work. So it's an absolute delight. It doesn't really feel like work. And so, yeah, I don't know what else to say about burnout. I think, the ADHD thing, the connection really is that, particularly people that grew up with ADHD as kids, whether they knew it or not, I can't remember the statistic. It's incredible, but there's something like, during the childhood of someone with ADHD, we experience like, I don't know, like thousands, tens of thousands more criticism than the average kid. And, there's a lot of sort of self-shame and, there's imposter syndrome and all kinds of things that go along with that. So we have quite complex relationships with our executive function. We're talking about these different parts of ourselves that want different things. Someone with ADHD, it's almost like, if you picture all the parts sitting in a boardroom, what I'm talking about right now is based on parts theory, which was founded by a guy called David Schwartz in the 80s. It's based on internal family systems, which is a therapeutic modality that I really respect and love and use. And yeah, I think the boardroom of parts for an ADHD person's just like, it's just a bit of chaos in there. There's a lot of internal conflict and shame and blaming other parts. And there's often not really someone in charge running the board meeting. And someone with great executive function, there's someone taking minutes and there's the chairman and there's there's roles and they all sort of coexist and work well together. And I think when we're in flow, that's probably what our boardroom looks like too. But our operating system often is quite chaotic. And so it just means that we burn bright and we burn out quicker sometimes because we get hyper focused on something and we forget to eat. We don't sleep. We stop functioning like a normal human when we get really excited about something. And so, I think there's just certain behavioral traits that ADHD, that shows up with people with ADHD that correspond really well with burning out quickly and burning out quite intensely. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a little ramble on
Totally.
ADHD.
No, totally. Really, genuinely, really interesting. Just tell us a bit about then. You've mentioned a few times what you do. You work with clients. So just tell me a bit about what is your business? Who do you work with? How do you work?
Yeah. So I run a coaching program called Flojo. And Flojo is basically mashing the word flow and mojo together. And that really is what we're trying to do is help people get into flow and really start to activate and harness their mojo, which is sort of their unique cognitive wiring, their unique sort of talents and strengths. And so it's a very simple formula, essentially. It's just about connecting with one's true nature. And so that's their unique cognitive wiring. It's also their North Star, their purpose, their values, really understanding that not just on a cognitive level, but on a somatic level and on an intrinsic level. And then, the second step is really about identifying the blockers, the things that block you from flow. So often when we think about flow, we think about adding flow triggers like saunas, ice baths, breath work, and all of those things are fantastic. They almost fix they can either help you hack your way into flow for a period of time, so biohacking, or it relieves the symptoms of stress and anxiety for a brief moment. And so those things are great to add, but they don't address the underlying cause. The underlying cause is usually I hate my business partner, or my romantic partner and I are on the rocks and I'm doubting whether we can make it through this next chapter together. Or one of my employees is creating heaps of friction in the business and it's causing me to be really frustrated and short with my other staff members. Or, there's all these friction points in our business, in our personal life, that often the friction point is so small, but the cumulative effect of all of these points of friction lead up to inefficiencies, lack of productivity, lack of focus, cognitive overload. And so really it's about identifying what is not aligned with your true nature. So an example for me might be, what would be a quick, easy one? Just looking around the room for a cue. Or maybe I'll go to my last burnout. So my brokerage company was a highly commission-based business. And so it created a culture of kill what you eat. So the sales people that sold lots of businesses and made millions of dollars, got lots of commissions, did really well. And the ones that didn't do very well. And so that clashed with it clashed with my values in terms of the way that I wanted to build a team culture effectively. And I didn't know that or really understand that at the time, but it was probably one of the reasons I didn't enjoy my business so much. And it's probably why at points there was a lot of, there was a lot of sort of difficult situations to navigate within the team that I was managing at times. And so it just didn't align with my values is all I'm saying. And so that's a good example of a blocker. And so what I did was burn out and then sell the company. But what I could have done is completely restructured the way that I built my team and remunerated my team to transform that culture into something that aligned more with my values. And so that would be a way of addressing a blocker.
Yeah.
So basically it's understanding your true nature, identifying the blocker, and then figuring out how to remove it. Yeah. And so that could be shutting down a factory and an overseas factory and bringing it in-house or outsourcing to some other 3PL, or could be anything. And so, I support clients with that essentially, with that process, and just do it in a very integrated way, and then teach them about their neurospicy brains and help them sort of set up systems in their personal life, but also in their business that work with the way they're wired rather than against them. Yeah.
Do you think a lot of founders are neurodiverse?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. And I think that's pretty explainable if I think about my own journey. traditional systems difficult. And so fitting into other people's systems is difficult. It's hard to stay employed and not be the annoying employee. I think I'm quite unemployable, actually. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs would proudly say that I'm a bad employee. I don't listen to instructions very well. I want to do things my way. And so if you want to make a living, it's a good way of making a living is just self-employing yourself. So yeah, I do think there's a big connection, overlap with creatives or any form of self-employment and ADHD. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a very last couple of questions. Any books you would recommend?
Oh, can they be random fiction books, or do they have to be like based on the topic that I'm interested
Whatever
in?
you want.
Well, I'm reading a fantastic book at the moment called Demon Copperhead, and
Called a what?
I should just read it. Demon Copperhead.
Demon Copperhead. Wow.
Demon Copperhead, and you should read that book purely for the joy of reading a beautiful piece of literature.
Okay.
In terms of books that I've read recently that have had a good influence, I've had a massive hiatus from sort of non-fiction self-helpy books at the moment. Actually, I'm just enjoying for the enjoyment of reading. But you know what? I'm just going to leave it with that one book. Is that okay?
Lovely. Yes, of course. And this is my final question. What advice would you give to your younger self? Your younger self can be any age. It could be 3 weeks ago.
Cool. Learn to enjoy the process. That would be, and yeah, I think I still need to tell myself that regularly. But yeah, I look back at particularly my tennis career. I think I so much unnecessary suffering. What a privilege to be traveling around the place, competing and playing a sport. It's a sport. It's playing a sport, but it didn't feel like play. And I think just enjoy the process. There's nowhere to be, nowhere to go, really. It's just enjoy what you're doing. Yeah, that would be my advice.
Love it. Jamie, I have loved this conversation. It's been fabulous.
Me too.
It's probably exhausting for you. I really, really enjoyed it. Just so many different things we covered, and just a fabulous view as well into ADHD and how that's, how that plays out in your life, how you're helping others. And so much of what you said totally aligns with my beliefs. So of course I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much for, making the time and just, showing up with a lot of curiosity. I really enjoyed talking to you.
This podcast is brought to you by Liberare Consulting. If you enjoyed today's episode, hit subscribe so you're the first to hear new conversations. And if you found it valuable, do a friend a favour and share it with them too.